Hello and welcome again to Conscious TV. My name is Iain McNay and today my guest is Alastair McIntosh. Hi Alastair.
Hello Iain.
And Alastair's written a few books. I've got three of the main ones here. Rekindling Community, Connecting People, Environment and Spirituality. Hell and High Water, it's about climate change. And Soil and Soul, People versus Corporate Power. And the focus of our program today is going to be about community and how important that is for people finding the connection between each other and also through that finding more about what lies beneath and who they really are at a deeper level. So Alastair, I know you work a lot with community projects and that's what we're going to focus on today.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there was a quote that I really liked from this book, Rekindling Community.
Okay.
Where you say, community is about creating synergies out of diverse parts. Becoming grounded means having one foot in the physical realities of this world and the other in the dynamics of people. And that also, I know you were brought up in the Isle of Lewis.
Yes.
And there again you talked about, in another book, about how it was for you there. 1 foot in the
one foot in the physical world, the real world, you might say, and the other foot in the metaphysical world, and what is behind it.
Yes.
Which is the dynamics of people, and with it the psychological, and if you believe in such a thing, the spiritual dynamics of what makes us human.
Yes. So what's your feeling about spiritual dynamics? How important is that?
Well, Iain, it's a question of what you take reality to be. And I suppose that where I come at it from is that there's times when I'll go outside and the Hebrides with clear skies are especially good for this. And you'll look up at the sky at the shimmering Milky Way and you'll see your own life and this small planet in a massive cosmological context, which we know from modern physics is all profoundly interconnected. That's in the macrocosm, but the microcosm of our inner lives is exactly the same. That if we go into ourselves and understand our inner lives, that too is held in the equivalent of a cosmological framework to which you might give the name God, Goddess, Allah, Brahman, Krishna, Christ. I'm not bothered what name is given to it, but it is it's fundamentally about the love that makes the sun and other stars go around.
And this is a theme that comes up quite a lot in your books, is the theme of love. That means a lot to you, doesn't it?
It's always meant a lot to me since I was a small child. And, you know, you grow up in a conventionally religious context. The context I grew up in was a Presbyterian, a Calvinist one in the northwest of Scotland there in the Outer Hebrides. And often in a conventionally religious context, it doesn't really come through very strongly. You get all this hell and damnation stuff and what have you. But when I really started to research spirituality, which was when I was a student, when I went to Aberdeen University in 1973 from the age of 17, then something in me called me to, well, basically to ask the question, is spiritual reality for real or not? Is there more to this life than just being egos on legs of flesh? And that's when I started reading whatever I could, trying out all kinds of meditation and so on, with that fundamental question, is there evidence for a spiritual reality? And the reason that mattered to me so much was the sense that if spirituality is for real, it's because of a cosmological underpinning of love greater than we can ever imagine, that is the root of the everyday love that we feel in all of our yearnings.
Yes, and you were also telling me when we talked yesterday that actually women have been very key for you, insofar you fall quite easily in love with women and they would actually push your boundaries and they'd ask the difficult questions in terms of the deeper meaning of life.
Yeah, I mean, that was always hugely important to me. I was, you know, from quite a young age, I was desperate to find the woman of my life, so to speak. Well, of course, I tried too hard and wasn't very successful in my teenage years. But, you know, as I did start to connect with women, they were often very much challenging me because I was brought up with a fairly conservative mindset.
Yes.
I remember being very pro-military, pro-nuclear weapons and so on, and getting challenged by mainly women at university on those kind of conventional male macho attitudes. And that getting me thinking, you know, perhaps there are alternatives to war.
Mm. I know you went to New Guinea when you were in your early 20s to do some
voluntary service
work.
overseas,
Yeah.
yes.
And that had quite an effect on you, didn't it?
Well, it did, because I went from the highly Presbyterian Isle of Lewis, and I was posted by just sheer chance, the way these things were in those days, to a Catholic mission station in a remote area called Gulf Province in Papua New Guinea, headed up by a retired Australian archbishop called Virgil Copas, of all things, and 4 missionary of charity, that's to say Mother Teresa nuns. And what they did was they started to open me up to mystical thinking, to liberation theology, in effect, to the idea that the Christian message is about liberation from the strictures of theology itself. This was not all that long after Vatican II. It was still very much in the air. But also it was about the preferential option for the poor. It was about the spiritual message being not just about individual salvation, but also what we do collectively in community with one another.
Mm. And were they was that important to them in Papua New Guinea community at that time?
Oh, it was. Yes. I mean, it was talked about quite a bit not by all of them by any means, but I certainly met plenty for whom liberation theology was a very live wire issue, and they were applying it to helping people to look at development. Because you see, it was just at that time when the big logging companies, the big mining companies, and the industrial fisheries companies were piling into Papua New Guinea, saying, we'll make you rich if we can take your forests, we'll make you rich if we can take your fish, we'll make you rich if we can extract your gold and copper. Well, of course, the riches didn't reach the village people in any way that they could usefully use it. The riches just turned villages into centres of alcoholism, violence and despair in many situations. And so what the radical side of not just the Catholic Church, but the Anglicans were very good too. I didn't meet any people from a similar Presbyterian background then. This was long before I became a Quaker. But certainly a lot of the people that I met there, they were very concerned about this because they'd seen it happen elsewhere in the world. And they were using spiritual teaching to try and wake people up to the Babylon, the Rome, the Egypt that was trying to invade their frontiers through these forces.
So they had an agenda of how they wanted people to see spirituality, interpret it.
Oh, yeah. Mm.
So how did this affect you inside? Because you saw a lot of poverty out there, didn't you?
Yes, I mean, things like, you know, we were trying to build our own school as we were teaching in it. I mean, I used to run classes when I would teach the boys, because I'd grown up, you see, in a crofting, in a kind of small-scale agricultural background on Lewis. You acquire skills that you don't even think of the fact that you've got them. But when we got there were no electricians to do the electrical wiring work in the school. So I set about wiring up the classrooms and teaching the boys how to do that as part of their science classes. I mean, it was such a laugh. Health and safety would have had a nightmare. You'd have half a dozen boys up a ladder wiring up a light, and then we'd all get together as one would press a switch and test, you know, would we have illumination or would we have a loud bang from the fuse box? And so that was a kind of scene, but then, you know, things would happen. Like I remember one day we came down in the morning and somebody had come and stolen a lot of our building materials, and we were pretty angry about it. And this wonderful saintly old bishop, at least I saw him as saintly, some of my colleagues found him hideously impractical. His response was, well, I hope whoever stole it needs it more than we needed it.
Mm.
And at one level, you see, it was hopelessly impractical. At another level, there was something about that spirit that just made you want to commit to working with and helping those people.
But did what he said to you register at the time? The
Oh, yeah.
fact that people who stole it needed more than you needed it?
Very much so, because
Yeah.
we were surrounded by poverty.
Yeah.
I mean, you'd try to go into, we called him Bish, we'd try to go into the bishop's house at night, and you had to walk over the bodies of sleeping homeless people in order to get up to his office. That was the kind of man he was. He had been Archbishop of the whole of Papua New Guinea. He had had the Archiepiscopal Palace in Port Moresby. That's what they call a bishop's home or an archbishop's home, a palace. And now his palace was this asbestos fiberboard building in an area that some of the expatriates would call the asshole of Papua New Guinea, because it was where a lot of the big rivers spewed out the sediment-filled load of what had been washed down from the mountains, full of malaria. It wasn't a popular place to be. He'd gone to one of the hardest pressed areas to live out his retirement. And this was how he did it. You know, he had a simple wooden bed with just a simple mattress in his office. That's where he slept. And he would work at his pastoral work, bringing in money to build a school. He would go and walk up and down the church every night, meditating or reading his Bible. At 4 o'clock every day, all of us teachers were invited. There were quite a few volunteer teachers from Australia, England, myself from Scotland. They were all invited at 4 o'clock after lessons every day to go and have a cup of tea with him. Well, none of the others would go because he never said anything. He would just sit there and, yes, yes, deep in meditation. I used to love it. I mean, you know, you talk about something like spiritual practice. For me, my spiritual practice in those days was 4 o'clock tea with a bishop. And once you realised he wasn't going to have much to say because he was a man of contemplation, but you had the privilege of sharing a cup of tea. It became like a kind of Japanese tea ceremony. And it was one of the things that held my sanity together under what were very trying circumstances during that time that I was in that posting.
So what was keeping you there? What was the motivation for you staying there?
Oh, goodness, because I think, just to go back a little bit, you know, when I got to university, the conditioning that I had, the social and family conditioning, was that the name of the game was to get a job on as high a salary as possible, and that was what constituted success. So it was a very materialistic paradigm of getting on and getting out and getting ahead and all the rest of it. And just in my last couple of years before I went to university, the minister, the Church of Scotland, the Presbyterian Calvinist minister that we had at Martin Memorial's Church in Stornoway, a man called Colin McLean, who was from the Isle of Lewis. He was you know, in many ways a very traditional and quite conservative thinker, but he was also really keen to stimulate our spiritual thinking. And I remember him doing things like showing us a Christian Aid film about poverty in the Third World, and me feeling outraged about that. And then as I got to university and started this inquiry into whether or not spirituality is for real, because my position was agnostic, the reason why it mattered so much is that it seemed to make a difference that if it wasn't for real, I was just going to go a materialistic line in life, as hedonistic as you could make it in every respect. You know, live loud and fast and go out with a bang. On the other hand, if there is more to life than just this competitive paradigm of materialism, if there is more to life, if we're more than just egos on legs, if there's something much deeper there, and if love is at the foundation of it, then we have to start on the journey of discovering what that love means, and that is a spiritual journey. And this was the kind of pivot point that I was on, and kind of like, you know, it swung over more and more to the spiritual dimension, and so that's what made me want to go out with voluntary service overseas who, purely by chance, posted me to Papua New Guinea when I finished university in 1977.
It's this journey from head to heart, which you obviously were on at that stage.
That's it.
That's a key thing for so many people.
Well, that's
isn't
it, you see. And then, 16 years ago when I met my present wife, Iain Nicholas, one of her big things was I was still so much in head. And so even though, I would like to have thought of myself as being in heart, she's constantly challenging me in our marriage to come more and more into the heart. So it's a long journey, but that's what spiritual journeys are, Iain, That's why we've got a lifetime
not so
to
long
do
a
it.
lifetime, actually.
It's not a quick fix job.
Yeah. So how does your wife challenge you? Give me an example of how that affects you.
She'll quite often say to me about situations, not necessarily with her, but other situations I'm dealing with, where she'll just say to me, have you still got your heart open to the situation? Or have you closed your heart? She doesn't need to say any more. I mean, that's me put right into my place. And of course, quite often it's not something I want to hear. I mean, in as much as I get shirty, I tend to get shirty when she says that to me, and then usually have to confess later on that she was absolutely right. If you're watching Viren, here's a toast to you.
Yeah. There's another quote I'm going to pull out here that I took from one of your books. It goes, mainstream manufactures people as a monoculture. It turns us out as clone rows of apple trees on pesticide manicured fields. Mainstream trains people by pruning. The song we sing from the mainstream is not really our song.
Yeah.
Now that's absolutely true, isn't it? It's not really our song. Yeah. And that's part of the challenge of our adventure in life. Can we find our own song?
Well, Iain, just, because I'm in London this weekend, and you asked to interview me just now, this morning I went to see the Pre-Raphaelite exhibition in the Tate, Britain. So about once a year I go to one of these big things when I'm in a place like London. And what's significant about the painting, the sort of 19th century work, is that they were reacting to what the Industrial Revolution was doing to people, to what the production line, to the factory was doing to the human soul. And they were desperately trying to pull out a recovery of soul. In African cultures, they often say that sickness, whether individual or collective, is caused by loss of soul. And so the name of the game is to call back the soul. And the sacred function of art is to play a role in showing us what the soul can mean. Now, the mainstream industrial orientated education system that we have, for many people, does not cultivate the soul. It squashes the soul. It focuses on merit in narrowly defined channels that slot nicely into the economy to make Britain a competitive nation and keep Britain great in that outward imperialistic sense where we want to be batting harder than everybody else. Well, that's all very well if your paradigm of what a human being is a profoundly materialistic one. But if your understanding of what a human being is that everybody has got a soul that is continuously in the process of being born, Jung called it individuation. He said it's not about individuality in the narrow sense of that word, but it is about becoming an authentic individual, an undivided, sort of undivided, a whole person. It's about discovering our wholeness. Now, healthy community is a context that helps people to find their wholeness in relationship to the fullness of life that includes other people. So that's kind of what I'm on about, and why, in juxtaposition to the competitive, aggressive society that we're so much surrounded by, I posit the importance of community and a mutualistic helping one another basis.
So what you're saying is, in effect, what community is doing, bringing us more together. It's actually helping us find out more who we really are.
Not just find out who we are, because that's almost like an intellectual exercise, but to realize.
To live, yes.
You know, we talk about self-realization.
Yes.
It's a birth of consciousness, a birth of being, a birth of essence. And remember that the Greek word "es," from which we get the word essence and essentialism, etc. Es means being. This is about the importance of understanding what it means to be a human being.
Say more about that, the importance of being a human being, because it's something that's not talked about very much.
Well, it's a big trip, isn't it? It's a big trip. I mean, what is a human being? My late friend, the American theologian Walter Wink, who wrote a really important trilogy called Naming the Powers, Unmasking the Powers, Engaging the Powers that Be. One of his books is called The Human Being, in which he reflects on the question, why is it that when Jesus refers to himself in the Gospel, he normally calls himself the Son of Man, or Walter said you could translate it as the Son of the Human Being, or simply the human being. In other words, he's identifying with his humanity. So here you've got a human being who at one level, you know, the son of a carpenter, he lived and died and ate and drank and all the rest of it like all the rest of us, profoundly human. At another level, in Christian mystical theology, his level of consciousness was such that he was able to say, I and the Father, or I and God, let's not genderize it, are one. Which, of course, is what all the great Eastern mystics would also say, that you get to a point, Hinduism says, when the Atman of the individual soul becomes one with the Brahman of universal soul. So my reading is that that's basically what Jesus was doing. But Walter's point is that what he's trying to show us is that the deep face of what it means to be human is to become divine. So as one of the epistles of Peter puts it in the New Testament, we are to become participants or partakers in the divine nature. As Jesus himself said, we're all branches on the vine of life, on the tree of life. As Paul put it, we are members one of another. As Muslims put it, all Muslims are as one body, and Christians say the same as the body of Christ. Now, what's this is kind of saying, Iain, is that if you imagine this fingernail is me and this one's you, and here's Krishna in the studio there, and there's Renata, your wife, also in the studio there, and so on. We can look at each other across a distance and think of ourselves as all profoundly individual. Or we can look in. We can take that inner cosmological view and see that if we go deep enough down, we come to a level where we are profoundly interconnected. John Donne, the great English poet, metaphysical poet, said, no man is an island entire unto himself. We're all joined like islands under the sea. And that's what it means to be a human being. It means to be profoundly human at one level. You know, including having a human ego and human needs and all the rest of it. I simply see the ego as our outward face on the world. The me as Alastair McIntosh, who you've presented as writing books. That's my outward ego presentation. But I'm undone if that's all I think I am, or if that's all you think I am, or I think you are. Because at this deeper level, we start to get closer and closer to each other. And this is the work of love. Getting closer and closer to each other until we get down to the God consciousness, the Buddha nature consciousness, the level as St. Paul in one of his good days said so beautifully, I live, yet not I, but Christ lives within me. And what makes that difficult is that to get from there to there in your consciousness, you've got to pass through the shadow. You've got to pass through all your unprocessed, all your undeveloped stuff, all the sides of me that I don't want you to find out about in this interview, but if you go and speak to Varen, my wife, or whatever, yeah, you see what I mean? And so this is why Jung said that the real spiritual work is the shadow work.
Yes.
Jungians will often say that 90% of the shadow is gold dust. In fact, I would think you could probably say 100%.
Yes.
It is where the SH1T hits the fan that we do the spiritual work, not just within ourselves, but in our communities. And hence why spiritual work that is not engaging with what is most difficult in human life, issues of poverty, brokenness, suffering, is, in my view, not really getting to the real roots of what it needs to be about. It's not just about nice bells and smells. It is about those things, but it's also about working at this level.
You told me a wonderful little story on the phone yesterday about how you spent your 47th birthday, which was 2 days ago, in the evening in the restaurant. Just tell that story again.
Well, you were asking me for examples of how do you become spiritually conscious. And I said to you that the problem is that quite a lot of the time we're not all that spiritually conscious. And old man Jesus said, you know, if you're seeking, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened, look and you will see, listen and you will hear. But a lot of the time we're not doing that, and so we're not switched on. And on Saturday I'd been speaking at a conference on climate change and violence, and it had been an all-day thing, and I got back. I was staying at a Quaker place in London, the Pen Club. Got back, was quite tired, went out to look for a meal, was finding a bit of difficulty finding somewhere suitable, and then I came to this fast food joint, and I thought, if I might on your phone, I thought, bugger it. I'm just going to get some fast food, because I actually quite enjoy that sometimes, so I prefer not to tell all my right-on friends with their tofu pies and what have you. And so I went in and I ordered lamb chops and chips. You see, very Hebridean meal, as I like to put it, something horrible and Hebridean, please. And so I sat down and waited for that. And it was one of those cafe-type places with, you know, yellow benches and all the rest of it. And I was sitting down waiting for the meal to come, when in come a couple of down-and-out homeless people, a man and a woman. The man they're both sober, but the man is clearly a deeply broken man. The woman looks like a walking dead person. She looks like a zombie. And the stench is unbearable. And there was some guy who had picked them up on the pavement and had brought them in to buy them a decent meal. So this guy goes up and he orders chicken suppers for them both. And then the three of them sit down at the table beside me. And, you know, gradually the place starts emptying and nobody else is coming in, because they're sitting right in the window with their big trolleys full of bags and
Oh, they put the trolleys in as well.
Oh, they brought the trolleys in as well. One of them dripping a green liquid. And the poor restaurant owner had to come and clean it up. But you know, huge dignity in the restaurant owners. They accepted that situation.
Yes.
It was me, you know, that was having the problem, waiting for my meal. In fact, my meal was just served by that time, and the stench of unwashed, profoundly unwashed human beings in front of me. And I'm kind of sitting there and I'm wrestling with myself, because I'm thinking, you know, I'm thinking of that passage, you know, inasmuch as you do this unto the least of these, you do it unto me, said Jesus in one of his sayings. I'm thinking of that kind of spiritual dynamic, the Buddha nature being in all. And I'm thinking, you know, I've got to be able to see God in these human beings as much as in you or my wife or whatever. And that's what I'm wrestling with. And then their meal comes and we're all beginning to eat, except the guy, the homeless guy, puts his hands together and starts making a long, very heartfelt, passionate grace, because he really had been very hungry when this Good Samaritan had come along. He really had been very hungry, you see. And here he was being given a supper. And it just profoundly moved me. So I put my hands together like this. And when he opened his eyes, I just kept them together for a moment. He caught my eye, and then he said to the other two, "Look at him, he's one of us." And I just winged it. I just picked up my plate, and I went over and joined them. Mm. Well, an hour later, we had made convivial, warm community. And the woman who had come in totally zombified, I said to her, "You looked like death itself when you walked in this door." She said, "Well, I was just cold. I'd been wandering around. I was trying to find a bus to get onto when this guy asked if I wanted a meal, and now I'm feeling okay again." Mm. Now, it was just an interesting little experience. It was interesting to see my initial reaction of revulsion, to be honest. Even though, I work a lot with homeless people and so on, these were really seriously bad cases. It was interesting to see that in myself, the wrestling with it, and then the warmth that came out of them. And it really
warmth that came out of them.
Yeah, the warmth came out of them. I ended up thinking, well, what a good way to have a 57th birthday meal.
So I know you work a lot with homeless people in Glasgow, where you live now, and every Thursday, I think you have a meal with them.
Well, we have a meal every Thursday. Yeah. I can't say I work a lot. I'm a director of an organisation called the Galgale Trust, which works with just the community in Govan, the part of Glasgow where we live, which is a very hard-pressed former shipbuilding community. Some of your viewers may get an idea from the Rabsy Nesbitt show on the BBC, and a number of our people are extras in that show. It's a real thing, yes. Or at least these people are the real thing, you see. So every Thursday we have a community meal, and I try to go to that whenever I'm able to, because we have folk come into our workshop on training courses where they learn woodwork and basically making things of beauty. But the deeper principle that we're working with is it's not so much about training them in employable skills, although that's maybe what we get the money for. The real thing we're trying to do is to rebuild community, to rekindle community. And when people find that they're able to do something useful, and you're sharing food together, that natural impulse towards community, towards human community, starts coming out of people.
Yeah, it's this isolation that we get more and more in society, and it's not just for people that are poor, but at all levels, people feel more and more isolated, and not only isolated from each other, but isolated from themselves at a deeper level.
Well, you see, I mean, so much of what we're dealing with in the Galgale Trust is addiction dynamics, alcohol, drugs, gambling, you name it. Now, where's that coming from? I mean, basically, as I see it, talking to many of my friends in that context, you typically have folk who have had pretty appalling, neglected childhoods, who haven't been loved for themselves as children. And there's this huge emptiness. I once heard somebody from Barnardo saying that the emptiness is, it's like that feeling of unrequited love you get in a newly broken love affair. And so there's that huge emptiness in the pit of people's stomachs. And that's what these addictions are trying to fill. As one guy, Billy, put it to me in the Galgale, he said, when I asked him why he was a heroin addict, he said, "I'll tell you, Alastair, heroin took away my pain, but it also took away my soul." Or I've heard one or two people say, "I came to realize that I was self-medicating in what I was using."
Yes.
And so the name of the game is calling back the soul. How do you call back the soul? You call back the soul by reconnecting with beauty, by reconnecting with one another, by doing that in very practical flesh and blood ways, like sharing meals and making things together. And, you know, we're talking here about the economically long-term deprived, those suffering from intergenerational physical poverty. But in my writing about climate change, I apply the diagnosis to the other end of the social spectrum, that the kind of workaholism, the kind of psychopathic corporate behavior, the kind of consumer materialism with which so many better off people fill the same emptiness in themselves is in many ways socially more problematic, although it's presented as being a virtue. That's what's driving something like climate change. So whatever end of the social spectrum you're looking at, we've got to call back the human, i.e. we've got to call back the level of humanity at which we connect with the divine. And that's the source to healing.
You went on a 12-day pilgrimage, I think quite recently, a couple of years ago, when you walked the Isle of Lewis on your own.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
Well, the island is about, I mean, in a straight line, it's only about 60 miles or something like that. From the south of the Isle of Harris to the north of the Isle of Lewis. It's one island, but separated by a range of mountains. And I'm just feeling deeply cold, I had been for several years, to make a pilgrimage to my own island, to the island that raised me. And I spent 12 days with a backpack, 20-kilogram pack, just walking very slowly, because I wasn't all that fit, and it was deep, treacherous bogs and mountains and so on. Walking through the island and visiting the ancient holy sites, the so-called temple sites, where sometimes an ancient temple, a pre-Reformation church, there may not even be anything left to see. It might be buried beneath the sand dunes. I coined the expression as I was going to these places, the less there is to see, the holier the place it be. That was my consolation for getting there and finding nothing. Other times there'll just be a few low walls or whatever, maybe a holy well. I was visiting these sort of sites and just getting deeper and deeper into the inner discovery of my own place at the level of its spirituality, including pre-Christian spirituality. A lot of the place names are to do with the fairies and that kind of pre-Christian understanding of the spiritual, the whole thing, and just a lot of the time on my own, out in remote mountain areas, and then walking through the villages, meeting people I'd grown up with, or meeting new people, and just, it was very moving in.
How was that for your inside development, your inside journey?
For my inside journey,
Yes.
you know, the island has got a very strong Calvinist Presbyterian religion that can be quite off-putting. Personally, I don't buy the theology of the Westminster Confession of Faith, with its idea that human nature is totally depraved, and the limited atonement, the idea that you have humans divided into the damned and the elect. Nothing you can do can change that situation, and that to appease the wrath of God because of original sin, we should all be damned, but Christ saves some of us. Christ's atonement on the cross is for only some of us who happen to be the elect. So I don't buy that. But underneath, there is a profound spirituality in those people. And so in the course of the walk, I did things like, on a Sunday, I went to a free church service where they hold by this Westminster Confession, and yet the minister's sermon, it was at Callanish where the stones were, the minister's sermon was deeply moving. It was actually about Job 12, about nature, about God being present in nature. And just the way these people touch you. And you kind of think at the end of the day, Iain, you know, what we say in our heads we believe, what our confession is, what our creed is, it doesn't really matter all that much. It is what comes out of the heart. And the spirituality of these people are of the heart. That story of, you know, with the homeless folk the other night, I said to this young man who had been buying the meal for these people, because he was clearly religious himself, and I said to him, "What's your religion?" And he just pointed to the spread on the table and said, "This is my religion." I said, "Well, that's the same religion as I'm happy with."
Yeah.
So the way that the walk affected me was having a number of encounters with people. The minister and his family were one of them, but a number of other people on the way that just deepened me into an appreciation that I had been raised in a profoundly religious community. And although I might not buy aspects of the outer structure of its religion, like you have in the Westminster Confession of Faith of 1647. Although I personally don't buy that, which is why I'm a Quaker, at a heart level, I really thank those people.
Mm. Something else that you do which really surprised me was you told me that you get the train to Paris when we finished the interview, and then tomorrow you're speaking to military people in Paris.
Well, I'm going to Paris this evening after this lecture for two purposes. One is to speak to Lafarge, which is the biggest cement company in the world, and I've been doing stuff with them for 10 years, unpaid, advising them on how better to run their business so as to have less damaging impact on nature and on human communities. And the fact that they're interested in that is, have been really encouraging, and they've made a lot of changes to their industrial processes. Last year, myself and WWF managed to persuade them to accept that they go along with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which means protecting indigenous people's lands. That's very encouraging. And then I'm going on to speak to the French military at the Saint-Cyr or Saint-Cyr college, their equivalent of Sandhurst in Brittany. And for the past 15 years with the British Defence Academy, the Joint Services Command and Staff College, I've been invited to speak to senior officers in training, 300 or 400 of them at a time, on the imperative of non-violence. And so basically...
how does that work? That seems such a dilemma.
I keep slapping my microphone. I mean, I'm sorry if I've just deafened all the listeners. How does it work? How does it work? Well, I start off with an image of Winston Churchill in the Battle of Omdurman in North Africa in 1898. And I say, Churchill rode into this battle on horseback with a sabre at his side. And then my next image is of the mushroom cloud going off. And by the time he finished his career in politics and the military, this is what he was presiding over. That is the rate at which military technology has changed in one man's lifetime. Friends, we need to think, is war still the way to find true security? Was it ever the way to find true security? And if peace is your business, as you like to think it is, do you perhaps also need to understand how the dynamics of non-violent action work, like you have been seeing with the Arab Spring, like you have been seeing with Burma, or you saw with Marcos in the Philippines, or with Gandhi in India, and so on? Do you also need to understand that if your concern is really about peace?
And what's their reaction?
Sometimes they've given me a standing ovation, and it's not that I'm not hard on them. I use some of the most outrageous images of war and torture in military contexts. And I say, this is what war does. It tightens the spiral of violence and creates suicide bombers and so on. You've got to find another way of bringing true security. And some of them think I'm bonkers. And many of them come up profoundly moved by it and say they hadn't thought of it like that before. I've got some very moving letters from air commodores and generals on my file at home saying, you make us think in ways we hadn't done before, you remind us of what the limits are, you give us hope that there might be a better way of doing things in the future. Last time I spoke, there was an old colonel came up who'd been chairing it, and he says, tell me, Alastair, you're very English, Colonel. He says, tell me, do you get invited to say these things to the politicians? And I said, no, it's only here that you're mad enough to invite me to say these things. He said, I thought that might be the case. What a pity.
Yes.
Oh, what humanity. You see, what humanity. Yeah. And the thing is, so many of these guys, with Iraq and Afghanistan, they have seen what real war looks like, and they are disturbed by it. They are open to seeking better ways, and things like what's happening in Burma suggest that there might be something in that.
You mentioned hope, and I have another quote from one of your books here, which I really liked. Hope is about being receptive to a new mind and a new heart. It is not about sitting back and waiting for a miracle to happen. It is about setting in place the preconditions that might constitute life and then getting on with it. And I think with hope we so much time we just hope something changes, and we aren't necessarily willing to meet the hope with our own impact, if you like.
When a publisher asked me to write a book on climate change, my problem was I couldn't be optimistic about the likelihood of us being able to stop it coming on when I looked at the science that was behind it. And in the course of that, I distinguished between optimism and hope. Now, that stuff about getting a new life and a new heart and what have you, that's borrowing from Ezekiel, who said, you know, we have to take out the heart of stone and get a new heart of flesh. Because so many of the problems in our world, environmental, war, poverty, meaninglessness, these problems are because we are disordered in our inner nature. They're fundamentally spiritual problems that have got outward material symptoms. So the distinction I make between optimism, you know, I don't think there's any quick fixes for the human condition, but we must always have hope, because this is the trajectory we're on. We're a species that's Homo sapiens sapiens that's only been on this planet for 200 million years, 200,000 years. We're a baby, only a fifth of a million years in our present evolved form. We're a complete baby on the planet. We're just learning what it can mean to be human. It may be 2 or 3 billion years before the rocks melt with the sun, as Robert Burns puts it, and the sun becomes a red dwarf and we all get swallowed up. There's a long potential life on this planet yet, and we have to set those seeds of a long-term Eden, reset those seeds of a long-term Eden. And that's why we mustn't get discouraged by things that fail in our lifetime, but we need to hold together a hope, a light that can lead into the future and nourish us right here and now as we're going.
We have about 4 or 5 minutes left. What would you say to somebody who was watching this program and they're moved, they're touched, and they're open to somehow sow their own seeds? What practical steps could they take?
Dig where you stand. Ram Dass, a great American contemporary spiritual teacher, very old man now, he said, if in doubt what to do with your life, feed the hungry. Simple as that. Feed the hungry, it can be literally, it can be metaphysical. It can be metaphorical, it can be in other ways. Just one quick example. I said I was at the Pre-Raphaelite exhibition this morning. I went into the coffee shop and they had some fruit scones. Temptation. So coffee and fruit scone, except she said to me at the cashier desk, she said, you get 2 for the price of 1. I said, I don't want 2, I only want 1. And she said, oh, but you get 2 anyway. I said, how much are they? Thinking it was an inflated price. It was only £1.30. And so I was in a dilemma, but I didn't want to. So I just looked back along the queue. I said, does anybody want a scone?
Wonderful.
And so an old woman was very grateful to have a free scone, you see. Now, your opportunities to feed the hungry can come in the most unexpected places, literally or metaphorically. I would say dig from where you stand and go with that kind of ethos.
Yes. And of course, it isn't just about practically feeding the hungry. It's the community that's created by the feeding. And of course, you feed something in yourself as well, don't you, by doing that?
You know, the Buddhists say, or the Buddha supposedly said, when somebody said, you know, how can I return such and such a good deed? The Buddha supposedly said, well, just tell the next person, you do it back to somebody else, and tell them to do it back to somebody else, and so on, and then the whole world changes.
That's fantastic. It's a great place to start the whole world changing.
Well, thank you.
Alastair, we need to finish. You have a train to catch. We need to finish our programme. I'm going to show you your books again. There's Hell and High Water, which is primarily about climate change. There's Soil and the Soul, People versus Corporate Power. And Rekindling Community, Connecting People, Environment and spirituality, which we focused a lot on during the interview. It has been inspiring, it's been very heartfelt too, and it's been something very different for us on Conscious Tea, which I appreciate. So thanks very much for coming.
Well, thank
you,
and thank you to your viewers also.
And thanks everybody for watching us out there. Goodbye.